The following program was made possible thanks to the generous support of our Kickstarter backers.
When first Holmes was born, then he got tubular and radical, yeah!
Sup, Holmes?
Beware, your host, Jonathan Ho!
Hello, Sinistar. It's so nice to see you again. And David Fox, the David Fox, wearing a Zak McKracken t-shirt, it looks like. Is that where did you get... Whoa!
I went to the very back of my closet, and I wore this once at a conference about 12 years ago, and then before that it was like in the 80s. So
it's funny you would be doing that. Yeah,
still clean. It still mostly fits.
No, it looks very good on you. Do you feel like, because I work for Destructoid.com, and we were just at PAX East, and a lot of our staff, or at least one staff member, was wearing a Destructoid t-shirt, and she felt like she was wearing a t-shirt with her own face on it. And she felt a little bit like, you know, people are going to think she's full of herself.
I'm hearing music in the background. I found it.
You found it?
I found it. It was neat.
It was like a puzzle you solved.
Okay, here we go.
And it sounds less weird now?
Now it's good.
Very good. Well, now I want to segue into all the puzzles you made in Zak McKracken. They made you feel like there's no way to solve this, and then you solve it. What a magical time that was. Played that game so many times, over and over again.
Well, for me, the best part was, thinking about how people would feel when they figured out something. I mean, when I was designing the game, it was to give people those aha moments. So they feel like, wow, I did it. And if they solved a puzzle and, through randomness or, trial and error, and, they said, oh, shit, I never would have figured that out, then that's a failed puzzle in my mind. It should be either you figure it out, either you can't figure it out, and when you do, you said, damn, I should have gotten that, or you figure it out and you have the win. But if you're like, wow, that's so obscure that I never would have figured that in 1,000 years or something.
Right. If you're left with that kind of bitterness, like there was no logic in that. It's not my fault I didn't figure that out. I love the aha moments, but I also enjoy I got to know the developer through seeing what their logic was after I get it through trial and error. But then it makes sense to me in retrospect, and it kind of changes my way of thinking. Sometimes I enjoy that more than just the, like, I'm smart, I figured out a puzzle moment, which is, of course, nice, too. But you get a great mix of those in Zak McKracken. And in the games you're doing now are also, in a way, big puzzles, aren't they?
Well, the game, are you talking about Thimbleweed Park, or are you talking about the Rube Works
I was
game?
thinking of Rube Works, which people might not know as much about.
Well, Rube Works was definitely, I wanted to do a Rube Goldberg style game, and in doing the research, I saw a bunch of, I knew the Incredible Machines from way back in the early 90s, and there were several new games or apps that were out that were Rube Goldberg-like. But when I searched for it, all I found were that it said Rube Goldberg-like, and I said, well, wait a second. If it's Rube Goldberg-like, that means it's not really Rube Goldberg. It's kind of like it. Is it possible that no one's ever tried to get the original IP? And I found RubeGoldberg.com, and on their website it said, send us an email if you want to license our cartoons. And I did. I wrote this impassioned letter, like, I'm the one to do a game for this, and here's what I've done. Here's my portfolio of games in the past. And I kind of let it go and figured, okay, I'd hear something, if anything, in a few months. And the next morning I get this phone call from this woman, named Jennifer, and she tells me that she's really interested, and they had gotten approached before, but from large companies, but there wasn't any passion, or they just wanted to make money off of it. They didn't know what the cartoons were, and about 10 minutes in the conversation, she says, I want to honor my grandfather's legacy. Are you recording? And I said, oh, your grandfather? So I'm talking to Rube Goldberg's granddaughter here.
Wow, really?
And we hit it off, and I got the license for it. And so what we did was took a bunch of his original, chain reaction machine style cartoons from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and stripped away most of the objects in the room, set the scene, put the rest of the objects in your inventory or your toolbox, and give you some string and some fan belts and other stuff that you could then use to build these. And they're basically, I can think of it like a mini graphic adventure, in that each level is maybe 10 to 20 minutes, probably for this audience, probably 5 to 10 minutes. But some people take longer. But you're given hints. There's a story. There's animals, and they're all funny. The whole thing, which I think was missing from pretty much all the Rube Goldberg style games in the past, were that they were physics puzzles, but there wasn't really much humor. And Rube Goldberg, the primary thing, when he was a cartoonist, the whole thing was to make you laugh. And if that was missing, and if you didn't have any animals in there doing crazy things, then it just didn't quite feel right. So this was the first official Rube Goldberg game, and it's on iOS and Android and Mac and Windows and Linux through Steam, and also in the Mac App Store. And that's it. So we're just revving it now. We just added German and Spanish, so we're in the process of getting that out the door. The iOS version was just submitted on Tuesday, so it should be out soon.
And do you feel, I get the sense that you grew up with an appreciation of Rube Goldberg. A lot of people know the term Rube Goldberg machine, but don't even know that Rube Goldberg was a cartoonist.
Right.
I get the sense, here's an off-the-cuff impression, that you thought, well, Rube Goldberg, I got like the license for that. People are going to eat that up. What I think people would have eaten up is by the guy who made Zak McKracken, like plastered over everything. Like
I did that afterwards, like when someone said you were just being too modest, and so I started changing the iTunes description, and making that more more on the top.
Sure.
You're right. I did grow up when I was a kid in the 50s. The Sunday paper had his cartoons in them. And so usually the chain reaction machine cartoons, I go through and if you've seen the originals before, there's usually on the left side there's a caption which includes a description of each step and what happens in each step, ABC, they're all labeled A, B, C, D, E, F. And on the cartoon there's letters that show what the different objects are triggering each other object. And as a 8-year-old or whatever, figuring out this logic, it was kind of like a pre-programming experiment or thing where you could actually, can I follow the logic of what happens, and can I picture it in my mind? And there's no animation, but can I imagine the animation, how each thing moves?
Yeah.
And I love doing that. And so that's my memory. Whenever I saw Rube Goldberg like machines, at museums or places, I was always really fascinated. So I always thought it was very cool.
So would you say that Rube Goldberg logic in those cartoons, which are interactive in a way, was in some way influential on how you helped start that kind of point-and-click game? There were other games, as we talked with Ron Gilbert about. There were other games in that general genre, but the games you were doing with LucasArts as their third employee, if I have that correct, were innovative and used more of that, less text-based, more image-based, more the thinking about how physical things work together as opposed to typing a sentence that's going to get you to solve your problem. You actually had to envision the chainsaw and wondering about, I still can't believe, because in Maniac Mansion, you get the chainsaw, but there's no gas.
Right.
And then in Zak McKracken, you get the gas chainsaw.
Everyone was ribbing the chainsaw in Maniac Mansion was. I think if Ron knew how much time people would have spent trying to find ways to make that work, maybe he wouldn't have done that, because he wasn't doing it as to be evil. It was more for ambience, to set the tone of this, these crazy guys and crazy people. Edward's family, right?
Yeah.
Walking around with chainsaws, and you had to watch out. You never see that, but that was kind of the expectation.
Right. It was one of those. It made you, in your imagination, you would think up something way worse than the game would ever show because you saw that chainsaw.
So because we got so many calls probably on the hint line, and people were always trying to figure out how to do that, we figured, okay, we'll give them the solution. But I want to make sure it was very explicit in the hint and Zach that this is a joke. It's not something you're going to try to kick out and actually use. You can't take it.
It's pretty far along in the game. If I remember correctly, it's on Mars you get the gas.
It's on Mars. It's not only someplace you can't use there, but you can't bring it back to Earth, and you can't find Maniac Mansion and jump into that game and use it there. So hopefully people won't spend any time thinking about that.
It made me feel acknowledged, and that was at the time I was playing that. I'd been playing video games most of my life, but most of them were arcade games. This was kind of the birth of these kind of narrative-based games that also had graphics and going beyond what Zork did and that sort of thing. And it was also the first time a game referenced another game that I knew of in a way that wasn't like trying to advertise Maniac Mansion, like go buy the original game so you can get the chainsaw. It was just like, we know you probably played it, and we don't mind breaking that fourth wall for a second and like giving you a quick wink because we're kind of cut from the same cloth. If you're playing these unusual video games, you might be a lot more like us than you might know, and we want you to know that. And I felt incredibly connected to the LucasArts or Lucasfilm games, I think, at the time.
At that time, it was still Lucasfilm.
Yeah.
And I think that we were. I'm not sure if we did that too much in Maniac Mansion, referencing other stuff. We might have, but it definitely became one of the hallmarks of all of our games, where there were always insider references, and if you knew it, then you knew what they were talking about. And there in Zach, there was also there's a poster for a couple of the other games, I think, at the pawn shop, and also in the Caponians area under Zach's bedroom, there's a poster from one of the games.
I don't know if I've ever even noticed that.
And there's a rotofoil, which is from Ballblazer. That's the vehicle from one of our first two games. It's like a triangle-shaped rotofoil in the Caponians room on the far left above a cabinet. And I think there might have been one or two other references too, but those are the ones I remember for sure.
I've been playing this game for, when did it come out? 25 years ago? Is that right?
Yeah, it was 1988, I think, 89.
Wow. Yeah, 26 years ago. And I've never known those references after all the times I've played it. I played the Commodore 64 version. I played the MF Towns version.
Right.
FM Towns, I'm sorry. That was in Japan.
Yeah, well, I think in the FM Towns, when we did the 256 color, I think we probably changed the poster. We might have made it indie, because by then indie came out.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
But go check it out. There is definitely a poster on the wall, probably in those two places, at least in the pawn shop. I don't have the art in front of me, but somebody could dig it up and get a link.
So, not that this isn't interesting, but I feel like you take for granted how interesting you are, because you're getting on a detail, and it's a good detail. I'm glad we got into it, but we're talking to the third ever employee of like one of the most influential video game companies in the world.
Well, back then when I was the third employee, it was a film company, and all I thought about was like, am I going to be able to make it through here without like crashing and burning and totally embarrassing George for even having a company that does games, and that was when I first joined. I remember writing a document which ended up in the Rogue Leaders book. Did you see that? There's a book about LucasArts, the whole history of LucasArts. It came out maybe 5 or 6 years ago, called Rogue Leaders, which is really comprehensive. And I wrote this whole thing about that where games should be going is really focused on story. And here we are, a film company. That's really what we're known for, is doing great story. That's really the direction we should be taking it, not just shoot 'em up stuff. And that was what I was interested in, and I think that kind of helped set the tone. Even though it's not what I was just hired as a I don't even know what I was hired as. We didn't have the term project leader. We didn't have game designer. We just I just was going to come on and do games.
And that meant programming them or writing them out?
Yeah. I think at the time we figured we'd do everything, and that's kind of what happened in the first games that we did. I did some of the art, I did coding, I did the design, I was the project leader, and I was just telling someone at the Game Developers Conference last week that it was like maybe 6 months into the project before I realized I was the project leader, because this is the first game, one of the first games, we never had that term and that role, and someone said, well, it's your game, how do you want to do it? I said, what? Oh, it is my game. Oh, and it's my team.
Do you remember what game that was?
Yeah, Rescue on Fractalus, which is my first game there. And that was a first-person fight game using fractal technology. It was the first game that used fractals. And so as you're driving, flying through these canyons, you're seeing these randomly generated canyons that pop up, but they were consistent. If you went back, it would be the same the next time through. And I was trying to do a Star Wars style game. When I first joined, I assumed that this is a Star Wars company, we could do Star Wars games. That's kind of what I was hoping for. So I really wanted to be as close to the movies as I could be, and I couldn't be in the movie or in the universe. I figured I could create games about that. And within the first month or two, I found out that, sorry, all the licenses for Star Wars are taken right now, and you can't do Star Wars games.
Oh, I like the Atari game. And
for arcade, for coin-op, it was Atari. For home, I think it was Parker Brothers. They had the 2600 cartridge-based games like Empire Strikes Back and a couple other ones. So I said, no, I think there was a risk. If they could get paid, I don't know how much money for the license, it's a guaranteed income, versus having us do production costs and take the risk of maybe having the game not be successful, then it kind of made sense for them to just get the money when they knew they were going to get it.
Sure.
In our case, it could have been a flop, or it could have been more expensive than we got back. But they were already taken, so it was kind of moot.
And was that the first Lucasfilm Games game?
That we issued two at the same time, Ballblazer and Rescue on Fractalus. So I did Rescue along with Oren Carpenter, who was my office mate. He was actually in the computer division, which was our parent group at the time, and he was known for fractal landscapes, and he did the fractal animation, fractal landscapes for Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. There's this sequence where the Genesis device hits this planet, and terraforms it. And as it's terraforming it, you see mountains, rising and lakes forming. And so he was the one who figured out how to do mountains. So when I sat down with him, I first ended up in his office, and I was in his office because our games offices weren't quite ready yet. We had our own area, but it wasn't put together yet. And I said, hey, so is there any way we could do fractals on a Atari 800? And he said, no way. Kind of like, and then he came back, I don't know if it was the next day or an hour later, and says, maybe there is a way. And we loaned him an Atari 800. He learned 6502 language and came back in 2 days with a demo of a fractal landscape flying through this 3D road time fractal landscape you could fly around. And that became the basis of the game. And so now we have the landscape. I created a story that would, that explained what you were doing.
Sure.
Basically, you're picking up down pilots that would die if you didn't get them, and shooting the enemy. And there's if you don't know the game, there's this really fun story that when I was first doing the game, I was trying to make, I was pretty much a hippie still, and I was trying to make it really peaceful, and I didn't want to have you blowing up other creatures, and So the idea was that there were no guns in the ship that you're flying originally, and you figured the way that you would get rid of the enemy that was following you and shooting at you was that you'd fly around and make these really sharp turns and last second, and they end up crashing into a mountain, and that's how you kill them. And I think the game was probably in pre-beta, maybe alpha, and George Lucas came by for a demo, and I sat down in my office. I gave him the joystick, and he starts pushing the red button. He says, "Where's the fire button?" And I says, "There is no fire button in this game. That's going to be for something else." And he said, "I want a fire button." Was this a gameplay decision, or was this a philosophical choice? For make it more fun, or because of philosophical? I said, "Well, I guess it was a philosophical choice." And said, "I want a fire button."
Sure.
So and he also came up with. He said, what we're looking for is intention. There are these aliens that are on the planet that you're basically in a war with, and that was in the story. But he said, what if every once in a while when you land, and when these pilots start, so you actually land, you see a pilot running towards you, and then he knocks on the door and you let him in, and you take off with him. He said, what if every once in a while it turns out that it's not a pilot, but it's an alien in disguise, and like he pops up and does something terrible? And so it's okay. So we thought about that, and that became the primary reason this game is remembered, aside from the fractals, is that there's this This is Gary Winnick. He was our first artist. He drew this monster. It's like these eyes bulging up, the Jaggi monster. You can find this on YouTube. Just search for Rescue and Fractalus monster or Jaggi monster. And if you might notice that this guy has a green pixel for a head instead of a white pixel for a head. And as he gets closer, he'll go out of view, and he'll pop up, and you see this big monster, and he starts smashing the windshield and punches it through, and all the poisonous acidic gases from the atmosphere come in, and you die. And that totally changed the game. And what we did was, this didn't happen until like level 8 or so. So for the first several levels, you're getting into this rhythm, you're picking up pilots, you're getting the next pilot, whatever. And we made sure that Atari never, and we never said anything about these monsters anywhere in the documentation. They weren't in the cover or the manual or any place. So the first time you see one is after playing for a few hours, and all of a sudden this happens. And I still get email from people who remember the first Jaggi pop-up experience, and people falling off their chairs, people screaming, people. There's a 5-year-old kid who ran out of his house yelling, "Mommy, there's a monster on my computer!" And college students were playing with the stereo turned up, plugged into hi-fi system, and if someone yells and falls off a chair, and your neighbor comes in, "Okay," they say, "Yeah, just," and they get this adrenaline rush because it was a real fright. It wasn't like a fake fright. It was like they really were afraid. And I don't know if I expected quite that level. And then from then on, when you play the game, every time you rescue a pilot, there's that edge, there's that tension that happens. Even though you know what it could be, you have to be ready to fry him with your shields if it turns out to be one of those monsters.
And at that point, you no longer feel like all the rules you've been taught by the game are necessarily going to keep you safe. If you scare me with a giant monster this time, maybe next time I won't know until he's in the ship, and he'll just yeah.
Well, in fact, what people often did was, the way it's supposed to be is you land, you turn off your engines, which turns off your shields. You wait for the pilot to come. He knocks on the airlock door, and you open the airlock door. He walks in. You hear the footsteps as he's walking in, and then you close the door, and then you take off. And people figured, whoa, that's a waste of time. Why don't I just open the airlock door before he gets there and just, save a little time? And if they do that, and it turns out to be a Jaggi, then he comes in the ship and he starts ripping apart the interior, and ship starts going haywire. And if you will end up crashing. You never actually see him, but you hear these sound effects, and the ship starts going like this as you're trying to fly. You can't keep control of it, and the only way to kill him is if you are able to launch back into space, and the vacuum kills him.
Oh, right.
But if you can't do that, and you die. And I mean, I remember someone was describing their experience when they see this big arm coming around in front of their face and grabbing them, and they were convinced that was in the game, and it wasn't. There were no graphics. It was just all in their head.
Huh. So that, again, I mean, one of the themes of the games you worked on then and some of the games you're working on now is what happens in your head versus what you're seeing on screen. Like, you have to make stuff happen in your head when you're solving the puzzles in Rube Works and in your classic games before, but leaving the suggestion for people to be able to discover that aha moment, giving that space for them allows for all this emotional experience to happen. And with this, you left enough to their imagination, but were suggestive enough and implied enough intent of insidiousness. I mean, this is a terrible thing you did to these people.
Right,
you put a monster in their ship.
Well, this is kind of a carryover from text adventures, where it all had to be in your head.
Right.
Here, if nowadays I would have shown it.
Right.
Because we would have the graphic, we'd have the space on the disk or whatever memory to be able to have the animation. But back then, this was like a 16K byte game, and you had to, we had no space for any of these graphics. We had to kind of squish everything down. So it was all done with sound effects and with just tweaking the controls, and that worked. So gave the effect. But that was the last time, by the way, that they would ever open the airlock door before the knock. The Jaggi monsters would never knock. They would just pop up and smash, and the pirates would knock. So you don't want to ever take that chance again.
Yeah.
And every once in a while you hit the wrong key or something, and you end up accidentally opening the airlock before you were supposed to, and so the tension was there from that point on.
Yeah. Huh. That's amazing.
You should definitely go check on YouTube.
For sure. I'm sure everyone who is listening to this or watching this has stopped and are now watching this because it sounds so good. And to see how it had to be done back then. Like, I'm meeting more and more people in their 20s, sometimes even teenagers, who are obsessed with old games in ways that I never expected them to appreciate, because I've grown up in this, better, more beautiful, more detailed, more fancy graphics. But there's so many people younger than me who like older games more than I do and appreciate them in a different way, because for them to be able to transport themselves to a time when those limitations forced these really interesting decisions that you just rarely see anymore because of that, they're really fascinated with it. I'm sure they're going to love it. What was the... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think that could be a downfall with current games, is that you have to do everything in full rendered, cutscenes or animation, or it has to look very film-like and very realistic. And as a result, you end up, not just with huge production costs to do it. It kind of takes a lot out of your imagination.
Sure.
If you go to a really good film, if they can show something, or suggest something without actually showing it, and it pulls it off, I think that could always, can often be better than trying to get you the effect. Did you see Birdman?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The last scene with his daughter looking out the window, and you never see him flying away. You just take that from what she's doing, from her expression, and what she's doing with her eyes. But in your mind, you probably remember him. I saw the movie twice, and the first time I would say, and then you see him fly off, and went back and watched it with my wife, and said, "Oh, you don't."
Huh?
That's
Really?
only in your mind. You don't see him fly away. You just see her, looking at him, out the window.
Sure. Whereas if they had shown him flying away, it wouldn't have felt as real to me. It would have been like a special effects moment, as opposed to an actual transcendence moment that I was left with.
So I think there's time times when we should pull back.
Yeah.
I think that might be one of the reasons that Ron Gilbert and Gary Winnick decided for Thimbleweed Park to go back to the 80s in terms of graphic style and animation, where it's much more about the dialogue and the story and the gameplay, and much less about huge hero cutscenes with full screen scenes that play out for several minutes, and Ron is setting it up so that there never are really long cutscenes. That the longest ones will probably be 10-15 seconds or something.
Wow.
And if they're longer, then they'll be interactive, and to make sure the player is not. It's not a movie. It's supposed to be a game. You're supposed to be involved in. I think I remember playing some adventure games later on where I started saying, okay, this is, it's interesting, but I really want to be playing. Would there have been a way to communicate this information without having me sit watching it for such a long time?
Yeah, to talk to someone whom was at kind of the birth of how cinematic do we want to make our games. You were there, and you were part of the company whose presumed purpose was to let's make them more cinematic. This is Lucasfilm games. It is like film games. So and it sounds like it was one of your desires to make games more like stories anyway. Maybe not necessarily using film techniques, but now at the point you're at, you're seeing games and saying maybe pull back from trying to be like films quite that much, because you can be more effective without it.
Now that we could do ILM level special effects on desktop computers, we can do it. Do we need to? And should we really do that? Should we really pull back and make it more about the story and the game and interaction, and less about those huge scenes? I mean, you do want payoffs, but the payoff should be restrained somewhat. And just because we can do it, maybe we shouldn't do it all the time.
For me, the payoff is when you swap minds with a dolphin and end up getting to go back into your own body. You don't have to live the rest of the game as a dolphin. That was enough for me.
Yeah.
That's from a video game you made. Oh, sorry.
It's your dog.
Yeah, she's getting mad about something. Sorry about that. I might have to go catch her. Oh, yeah, so it's PAX East. I have some of my staff members staying here with me. Maybe you can help. Hey, Rob, are you there? Dog? Rob or dog? That was almost rhyme. Not quite. She's quiet for now. Sorry about that. I do apologize. That's ambiance, I suppose. Oh, and suggestion. You're probably wondering what that dog looks like right now.
I think it's a
dog for you.
It looks like it's a poodle-ish kind of a dog.
She does sound bratty like a poodle,
she's so small.
She's about she's like a cat-sized dog. So what after your first game was Zak your second game at Lucasfilm?
No. So I did Rescue. Then I remember being in. This is before we had the help of other people on staff to do things like conversions or manage conversions or translations, and I think for the next year after that, I was having to manage conversions to other platforms and translations to other languages, and it just was taking. Even though I wasn't doing a lot of it myself, I had to make sure that it matched. It was good enough to match. You think you're done with the game, yay, but no, you're done with the game, and now you get to spend another year or so, managing other versions of it. Later at Lucas, we ended up getting teams that would just focus on that, and let us go off and do the next project. So the next game I ended up working on was Labyrinth, and this was based on the Lucasfilm produced Jim Henson movie from mid 80s.
Yes, I'm a big fan of that movie.
David Bowie.
Terry Jones, I think, from Monty Python was involved in it.
He might have been one of the writers, possibly.
I think so.
And Jennifer, what's her name?
Connolly. Strangely enough, another guest who's been on the show, Lauren Landing, his wife did some of the special effects for that movie.
Okay.
So small world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this was I think Lucasfilm said, okay, this is a first attempt at doing a license-based game. Do you want to try this? And so we said, okay. So we looked at the script. We got some early shots of the movie, and then a group of us went off to London for a week to brainstorm. And so me, Noah Falstein, Charlie Kellner, who is our best engineer in terms of doing the coding for this, and our general manager, Steve Arnold, Brenda Laurel, who was our producer at Activision. It was going to be an Activision game. This is before we were publishing our own titles. And Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fame. You know who he is, right? Douglas Adams.
Yes, I do. I was muting myself because my dog is going completely berserk, but I was listening to every word you were saying.
Okay, good. And so we mostly were spending a week with Douglas and also Christopher Cerf, who was with Children's Television Workshop and worked with Jim a lot on Muppets and stuff. So we spent a week there just crazily brainstorming the game and based on the script, because I hadn't seen the movie yet all the way through. And that was amazing. We came up with some really funny stuff, some stuff which seemed much funnier there in the brainstorming session than it probably did when we came back. But when we came back, it was basically up to me to take reams of notes and ideas and figure out how to mold it into a cohesive game. So I was became the project leader and the lead designer, and this was really our first graphic adventure game.
How much pressure was that?
That was a lot. Yeah, I was
trying to imagine brainstorming.
I thought I was going to get help, and I was totally. I mean, I had. Unfortunately, unfortunately, I had read Douglas's books, so I was already like in awe and kind of tongue-tied, and he was just really sweet guy, but I was feeling totally intimidated and like here these guys are really fast, really witty, and like if I got a few ideas out there in the process, that'd be great, but mostly I felt like I was out of my element, kind of like one of those, being an imposter with a group of really
sure.
Kind of
yeah. And had you done any comedy writing, or do you tried to focus on comedy?
No, I think I had. This is we had not any funny games. I hadn't done comedy writing. I think at the best of times, I was funny and I could be really funny, but with my wife or with my kids, but not with Douglas Adams. So
I'm sorry, I'd be remiss. I wouldn't want to miss this if we move on from it too quickly. But before Lucasfilm, did you work in games in any capacity?
Yeah, well, my wife and I opened this public access microcomputer center. It's a nonprofit, 1977, and we the idea was I'll tell you in a second why we did it, but
sure.
It was basically we were looking for a way where I could learn about computers and also do something really cool, and it was educational. We taught beginning programming to kids and to adults. We had started with 10 computers, and we ended up with like 40 after a while. These are all micros. So at the time it was like there was something called the Processor Technology Sol 20, which was an 8080 base. We got Apple IIs, Atari 800s and 400s. Since we were nonprofits, a lot of these ended up being donated. And kids would come in and for like $1.50 an hour would rent time on the computers to play games on them, or use them for programming or for class projects. Field trips would come in. We would take computers out to schools and do in-service training with teachers, or field trips with kids, or classes with kids. And during that time, I did my first. One of the things I was doing was getting games from other early game companies like Broderbund and Scott Adams, Adventure International. And with Scott Adams' work, his games came out on the TRS-80 Radio Shack computer. They're all written in BASIC, and I would take those, I would convert those to run on, say, an Apple II, and as a programmer, with their permission, and then send it back to him. He would sell it, and we would get a royalty. So my first experience with doing professional game stuff was by converting published games in BASIC, and these were adventure games, coincidentally.
And I'm trying to imagine, because again, you seem as though you take yourself for granted a little bit, and that's a wonderful sign of humility. It speaks to your character. But to be someone who is at the forefront of, like, let's make computers for everybody, let's just start it on. I mean, this was a completely, as I know it anyway, I was 1 year old in 1977, so of course I could be wrong, but I don't know of the personal computer to be a thing that was something that was for the mainstream public. It was for enthusiasts and people who use them professionally at best. But something in you and your wife drove you to take this big risk. I mean, this was your adult lives at that time.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we weren't getting paid. We had to get loans to cover it and to get it going. We made enough money to keep it going, even though it's nonprofit, and get some money, get paid for it. But let me finish this and I'll come back.
Sure.
So the next game that I did was an original game for Children's Television Workshop. They had for Sesame Street, they had a theme park they were opening I think in Philadelphia, called Sesame Place. And so I did this game called Mix and Match Muppets. Really simple Apple II game where you could choose the head of one Muppet, the body of another, and the feet of a third. Cookie Monster would be this animation of him mixing up a bowl, and you come back with this new creature as a composite, and algorithmically would give him a new name, like Ernie, Monster, whatever. You're combining the names of the three body parts, and then you get to go again. And that was basically it. They wanted like a 2 or 3 minute experience that would be at this theme park, and I think it actually did get sold publicly. I mean, if I search for there's a Muppet Wikipedia page that lists it, has a picture of it.
Was that one of the first Muppet games? Was this still the 70s, or was this the early 80s?
Yeah, this was like 79, I think.
Wow.
So it was the first one. I don't think we got royalties. We just got a fee for this.
Uh-huh.
And it was just, it was a pleasure just to be able to do a game and get it published. And then I was also writing books. A friend of mine was, who I credit for helping me get launched in this, a guy named Mitch Waite. And Mitch was a pretty well-known computer book author. He wrote books on programming and other parts. And he said, hey, why don't we co-write some books? So we ended up co-writing a book on Pascal called Pascal Primer, and then one called Computer Animation Primer. And on the Computer Animation Primer book was focused on the first half was kind of looking at animation techniques on different computers and also high-end computer animation in the movies and stuff. And the second half was a tutorial on how to use the Atari 800 to do animation using its features like smooth scrolling and clear missile graphics and displayless interrupts and things like that. And I completed that during the first part of the book. That's how I made my first connection to Lucasfilm, because when I was researching what people were doing in the film industry, they're neighbors of ours essentially. We're both in Marin County, so I called them up and said, hey, I'm doing this book. Can I hang out with you guys and learn about what you're doing, get some demos and get screenshots, and and they said sure. And that's where I first met Lauren Carpenter, who would eventually be my office mate, and Ed Catmull and some other people, Albie Ray Smith. And these are all people who eventually started Pixar, because that's where Pixar was Steve Jobs buying the Lucasfilm computer division and then making Pixar out of that. And a year later, when my book was completed, the manuscript was done, it hadn't been published yet, is when I first heard that Lucasfilm was starting up a games group. And I heard it from one of our members at the computer center who happened to work at ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, and said, hey, you should check this out. And I called up Ed Catmull, who I had already known from my book, and said, I would love to be a part of this. And he said, okay, we're just hiring the guy who's going to be managing it, Peter Langston, and as soon as he comes on board, he can come in for an interview. So I showed him my manuscript, and he liked my energy. The fact that Atari was actually funding, gave George Lucas or Lucasfilm like $1 million to start off this computer group, this games group, with the idea that Atari would have first rights on any games we did to publish them. It's just like a perfect match. It's kind of like if I went back and said, if I said, here's the path I have to take to get there, write a book on Atari, write a book, do this, be in this location. And it's like, it's like amazing how I managed to do exactly all those right things, end up in that right place, and to actually know these people, and having met these people ahead of time, so I had a way in to talk to them when the games group actually started.
Was there a lot of competition? Do you think there were other people they were looking at that time, or was this such an undiscovered country that? Yeah,
I think it was unknown. I think Peter, who started the group, his background was not. I mean, if they'd gone the traditional route, and they had said, okay, we're going to look inside the industry for people who we could hire who know how to do games, then I don't think I would have been hired, because I had no real, other than that Sesame Street game, there was no real experience I could pull off. But they were actually looking for people who could think outside the box, who hadn't been brainwashed by the established way of doing computer games or video games. So that combined with, I guess, with my enthusiasm and timing and whatever else, that's how I ended up being the first. It's really the first person Peter hired. The other person came in from the computer division, named Rob Poor, who was, I think he was doing stuff with lasers, and he was more interested in doing games. So he came over as a side hire. So he came in before me, but I think I was the first outside person that was hired by Peter, and the third person in the group. So.
For games, because you had shown you love this regardless if this is going to make you a lot of money, and that you're excited about what can be done that hasn't been done yet, as opposed to just like following the path that is proven to be financially successful or whatever. You had this passion for where things could go, is how it sounds. And then you make Rescue, which did a lot of new things, and then you get to make Labyrinth with Douglas Adams.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, let me go back a sec.
Sure.
I mean, well, first, like the thing about the money thing was totally accurate, because like when I finally interviewed with Peter, then took like another month or two before the green light was given to start hiring people. When I finally got the news that I was hired, I was so excited. I realized I never asked what the salary was going to be, and I didn't care. I mean, I figured whatever it was, I would get something.
Sure.
And so it just kind of weird to think, God, that's so naive. You should, negotiate your terms, your salary, or whatever. I just said, hey, I don't care. Oh, whatever you want.
And then you were a project director without knowing it would happen. That's just that you were part of the force, the generation that established how video game development teams, how the hierarchy works. And before you know it, I guess there's a position called a project director.
Right. We called it project leader. I think some companies have it as producer. EA was called them. I think the producer at EA was often the designer also.
Right.
And for us, it kind of evolved that way too. Like the person with the idea, it was usually the designer was usually the project leader also, because they were the keeper of the vision. And it was it wasn't until years later where they kind of started splitting it, where they had a designer and a maybe someone who helped as a producer to do some of the other elements. So I wanted to go back and just explain why I did the computer center.
Mm-hmm.
So I went back a few years before that to say to 1976. I had actually been doing counseling with people. I was a counselor, and I got to the point where I felt like I wasn't having a big enough impact. I was only working with maybe 10 or 12 people a week, and I wanted to reach more people, and had this weird idea that maybe you could create a computer game that could affect people's lives in some way, and give them, reach much larger audiences, but have them play through a game and in the process, change something about their point of view or the way they think about things or themselves or whatever. And I really wanted to do some kind of interactive Disneyland, was what we were describing, where you'd have a theme park level experience where instead of a static ride, which was the same every time you did it, it was essentially interactive. I mean, I didn't have the words to describe it then. It was VR, and or AR or something where there's a computer component to the game that would, but it would be immersive, completely immersive, or it'd be environmentally based. And that was kind of where I wanted to go. And when I first got hired at Lucas, I made sure to tell Peter that this is what I really want to do. And he said, "Oh, that's really cool, but right now we're making Atari games, so we'll, maybe we'll get to that eventually." And then when Steve Arnold became the general manager a few years later, when we kind of evolved from being more of an R&D group to more of a production group, Steve Arnold came in. I think Peter eventually left because that was his focus, is more R&D. I told Steve that, and he said, "Wow, that's something I'd really like to do too, but right now we're going to do this." So in 1990, after I had been doing, I did worked on Maniac, then I did Zak McKracken, and then I worked with Ron Gilbert and Noah Faustine on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And three of us were kind of co-designers, co-project leaders on that, because we had a really tight schedule to hit the film release. Steve said, "Okay, now you've done this, I really need you to help as the director of operations of Lucasfilm, of LucasArts, because we're now growing so fast. It's basically a flat organization. Everyone was reporting to Steve, and it was just unwieldy. So he wanted me to kind of create structure, like another tier of management within the group. So I ended up hiring the head of a customer support group, head of a QA group, head of art department.
Did you hire Tim Schafer?
I hired Tim Schafer.
Wow.
This is during this period. We were looking for what we called scumlets, which were scum programmers that would be kind of assistant scum programmers, and we were looking for about 4 or 5 people who could come on to help Ron, for example, with his next game, which was going to be Monkey Island, to do the scripting. And because by then the games are getting big enough where it's really hard for one person to do it. And so I was in charge of working with Lucasfilm HR department to define what the job positions were, and then I was the first person who reviewed all the resumes, the stacks of resumes that came in. I remember getting this stack like this. Yep, it's in the picture. And ended up taking them into 3 piles, which was no, maybe, and yes. And Tim was in the I think in the yes pile. His was as was Dave Grossman, who was also on Monkey Island with Tim. They both worked on that together, and we ended up. I was looking for someone who could do comedy, because I figured anyone who had any programming background could learn Scum. That wasn't a big deal. But we couldn't teach them how to be funny, or how to be witty, or how to write. And when I got Tim's resume, I don't know if you ever saw this online. He actually wrote a thing about this.
No, I don't think so.
He sent in a resume and query letter, which was basically a graphic novel, a comic strip, like 2-page comic strip showing him walking into Lucasfilm's offices, getting applying for the job, getting the job, being really happy, and then going for it. And it was like so out of left field and so wacky that it just totally stuck out as being really, really creative and really risky. I mean, if you knew what he was doing, this is not what you usually do. When you do a cover letter for a job, is do it as a comic.
Yeah, I've never risked that. Not yet, anyway.
No. So he tells this story. I mean, you should again look for this. Like he wrote this up relatively recently with all the pictures. He came in for an interview, and I got to interview him first. And if you know, I think there's the first two games that we did, Rescue on Fractalus and Ballblazer. Around the time they were in beta, we gave copies on floppy disk to Atari to review for the marketing department to figure out how they're going to sell these games. And within a week, they were across the planet on what the BBSs, the equivalent of online, the bulletin boards where people were downloading pirated versions of them. And the titles of these were different than the final release titles. So it was Rescue Mission and Ball Blaster. And so when Tim came in, I said, "Hey, have you ever played any of our games?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I really like Ball Blaster." And I said, "Ball Blaster, eh? Realize that's the pirated copy." And he goes, "Ooh," and he just like got really embarrassed and turned red, and he was like really upset because he figured he had just totally blown the whole interview. That there's no way that we would hire him knowing that he had pirated our games and played a pirate version of our games. And then, of course, he got the job. That was more.
Were you tempted to count that against him, or did you see it as like he is a problem solver, he's going to dig deep into things?
The only thing I would have counted was that he didn't know that it was a pirated version, and the fact that everyone was doing it. So by that point, the pain of it had pretty much. This is like 7 years later. So by then it was like it probably more people probably played our. I mean, if you want to look at it from a philosophical, big overview picture, it was kind of like giving out free calling cards of Lucas. Everyone now know who Lucasfilm Games was, and I'm sure more people ended up playing the game than ever would have if they had to buy it.
Sure. A guy who you influenced a whole lot. His name is Sosowski. I've pronounced it wrong, I think. He made a game called McPixel, which is kind of like Zak McKracken, but turned into like 5-second segments, and the logic is completely thrown out the window. You like have to pee on a bomb so it doesn't explode, that sort of thing. So he would love you a lot. And he actually partnered with the Pirate Bay, which is the premier pirating website, to get his game out for free, and then his sales went through the roof. Just like you said, the free calling card. You were, whether you wanted to or not, you were one of the first to do that.
Yeah, it was painful at the time though, because it felt like a lot of work, and then it went out the door.
Yeah,
but
of course.
Like, okay, well, it's what happened, and maybe it turned out really well.
Yeah.
So I'm sure as a result, those two games didn't sell anywhere as much as they would have in terms of numbers.
Yeah.
That combined with the fact that around the time they were supposed to come out was when Atari ended up getting bought by Jack Tramiel, and all the contracts got renegotiated, and the whole thing was delayed for another year, and so that meant that the pirated versions were the only way to get them for like a year and a half or 2 years.
Yeah.
And by the time they came out, I think Atari was already way down on this downfall slope. So I think a lot of people know the Commodore version, which came out after we did a conversion, which wasn't pirated. And at least not on that scale, and people could buy it, actually purchase it. Sure. I actually like the Atari version better just because Rescue really needed a CPU to do the frames, and Atari's CPU was like 60% faster than the Commodore's. Had a faster clock rate, and just meant that it could do maybe 8 frames per second instead of 5 or 6.
Right.
And that made a big difference when you're, in terms of how it felt.
Sure.
So going back to the interactive Disneyland stuff, the last thing I got to do is after, Steve said basically if you do director of operations for a year, then we're going to do this location-based entertainment project, which is essentially, something for theme parks that you can be in charge of in terms of the software end of it, the design part. If you do this first, so I said, okay, I'll do it. So I did the directive operations for a year. When I was done, I hired Lucy Bradshaw to take over my role. She ended up, I think, as VP at Maxis, and she did a fabulous job kind of managing all the pieces, and she liked that. I didn't really like doing that. I was much more interested in managing a game and doing the creative part, not so much managing a group of other people's game or other people, programmers, and doing all that. I wouldn't say it was painful. It just wasn't as much fun as doing a game was.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be my choice of a career.
Sure.
But then I did this project called Mirage. It was a joint venture with Hughes Simulation, Hughes Aircraft, and it was basically a pod simulator. You get inside as a 2-seat, vehicle. It was about 12 feet in diameter. Had a screen that was about maybe 120-degree field of view. Had 3 projectors that were blended seamlessly, so you had like soft edges, so they looked like one big scene. We were using professional Evans and Sutherland image generators for the landscapes, so we were looking out at, with fog and all anti-aliasing stuff, which didn't exist on home computers at the time. Surround sound, and it was basically, I got to do a Star Wars game, so it was basically a Star Wars flight game. It's kind of like taking Rescue on Fractalus and putting it on steroids. And you're flying an X-Wing or a TIE fighter, and you're fighting against others in this landscape, flying around and doing stuff. And I got to work with person Scott Card on this, and he had been doing some work with Lucas from time to time as a writer, and he did a writing workshop with us, storytelling workshop with a bunch of us. He I know he did the insults for Monkey Island, insult sword fighting. He was the writer for that. I don't know if you knew that.
Scott Card was?
Yeah.
What? Next time I'm expecting you to say, like, and the Kennedys are coming over later. Like, the Orson Scott Card, a guy who worked on Star Trek, so you're 1 degree of separation from them. George Lucas, Douglas Adams. It feels endless. I'm sorry.
And Steven Spielberg too.
Yeah, throw him in there. Sure.
And so Scott Card did. He helped me with a story overview for the 3 games I designed, and I'd come up with a game design, then I would say, okay, here's the idea, and he kind of went back and forth a few times on it. Then he would write up this kind of description of what a typical family would be doing as they're walking into this theme park and doing this attraction, and created a whole story with the characters and everything. That would be like maybe a 2 or 3 page thing that would kind of give you an idea much better than just trying to describe it like what from a purely game design point of view. Sure. I had the totally opposite experience with meeting him that I did with Douglas Adams, which was that when we first met him, he came to lunch at the ranch, the Skywalker Ranch, and I had not read any of his books at that point. So to me, he was this guy who we were having lunch with. And I wasn't tongue-tied. I wasn't intimidated. I was relating to him more like another creative person who I'm told did really good stuff.
Uh-huh.
That's the way to do it, by the way, because then at least for me, I'm not like all embarrassed and tongue-tied. It was like since I didn't know from firsthand what he had done, I wasn't wowed in the same way that I would have been. Of course, I read all this stuff afterwards and really loved it, but I already established a way of being with him before that, so that I didn't get overwhelmed. And it's like someone who you grow up with someone who turns out to be a movie star or something, and you don't relate to them like the movie star. You relate to them as your old friend that you grew up with, because that's what you set up. So that was nice. I recommend doing it that way. If you're going to meet someone famous, do it before you know their body of work, and then you can relate to them as a person and not as a movie star or some famous person.
Sure. Huh. And if you don't mind going back to how the Labyrinth game ended up turning out, at least how you felt about how it turned out.
I think it came out pretty good. I think we did a really good job of capturing the movie. One of Douglas's ideas, which was pretty wacky, was to start this graphic adventure game as a text adventure. And the idea that, kind of analogous to the Wizard of Oz movie, starting off in black and white and turning into full color when you enter Oz. Here, the idea was that we start off as text adventure and we turn into a graphic adventure when we enter the world of Labyrinth. And in the game, you start off doing this really simple text adventure, and the goal is to end up inside this movie of this movie called Labyrinth that is playing.
Sure.
And then you watching the movie, and the first scene in the movie is David Bowie's character sucks you into the movie, and then you have to do this whole adventure as a graphic adventure. And I think people felt okay about that. I mean, I know I hated it after a while because during testing I kept having to go through the text adventure to get to the next part.
Yeah.
But we were using that as like a training grounds because we knew we didn't want to do a text parser, at least most text adventures were using at the time. So I came up with kind of what I was calling a slot machine interface, where you'd have like two bands of words, like a verb and an object, and you could kind of scroll each one, and then you could have them match up, and these are the two things you're using. So you knew what your possible words were that you could use, but you didn't have to type them up, and they were just So it's like a precursor to what we did in Maniac Mansion, where we had a set number of verbs at the bottom. Here they were in a wheel, and the objects were the objects that were in the room or in your inventory.
Huh? So that's like the pre-scum,
yeah,
scum, preformed scum. Wow, amazing.
Yeah, and I know Charlie Kellner was the technical director on this project, and he came up with a way to do character animation that scaled, so we could make people smaller walking towards you. And I know that his character engine, that whole engine ended up both in I don't think we did scaling, but it did end up in Maniac Mansion. It also ended up in Habitat, the same basic cell-based animation engine. So there are things that came out of the game that were used elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
It was Commodore 64 was the primary platform for that, and I think we had smooth scrolling on the screens, and it was, I think it was a good game. I think the movie itself at the time did not do that well.
Right.
And it's one of those movies that kind of became more of a cult hit afterwards, and I think as a result of the numbers not being great, Activision said, well, we're not going to put much money into marketing it, so the game itself probably didn't sell that much.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think of it as like one of my favorite games that I've worked on, but people who played it tell me they like it. So maybe if I went back and played it again, I would say, yeah, this is actually kind of fun.
Sure. Yeah, and maybe enough time has gone by, you won't look at all the things you wish you could have done with it, because now you'd have the capacity to. But without that game, we might not have had Maniac Mansion, Zack McKracken, Monkey Island, and now like an entire genre, pretty much.
Right. And I know that I'm sure Ron was influenced in some ways with some of the ideas, but he kind of threw a lot of this out and just kind of reinvented it. But we have that. I know he didn't take any of the game code. All that was stuff he did from scratch for Maniac Mansion. But I think there was a similar feel. We had word balloons. I think there are a couple of things that were similar. But
yeah. So with all of these things you've done, is Zack McKracken still the thing you think you're most well known for? From personal experience,
probably for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's probably of all the games I did at Lucas, it was probably my favorite.
Yeah.
It was the one that matched my interests at the time. I still like new agey stuff, and I wanted to do it in a way where it wasn't like woo woo. It was more tongue in cheek, but also let people play in a universe where there was such a thing as mind linking and teleportation and aliens and all these other things, all these topics which I loved. X-Files. I loved that whole genre of everything, science fiction and stuff.
I think you probably, gosh darn it, you probably influenced the X-Files, because before that, you maybe, would we have debit cards now if it weren't for Zak McKracken? I don't know.
I call them cash cards.
Yeah, but you saw this coming. You saw, well, how it looked to me, because for people who don't know, so we have a lot of subscribers to the show who might not know who you are, and shame on you if so. But Zak McKracken text graphic adventure game took place slightly in the future.
Yeah, it was supposed to take place in 1997.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and it came out.
That was the future when we were doing it. So I think we were building this in '88. So
yeah. So it was like 9 years in the future. So it wasn't like a sci-fi future, but it was like how trends, because you'd been around at this time, you'd seen how technology had changed, you'd noticed how there's trends heading a certain direction. So you had debit cards instead of cash, which was also a great gameplay mechanic, a saver of having to manage quarters in your inventory and whatnot. Mm-hmm. You had tabloids more popular than ever, so you had it about a tabloid reporter who actually wanted to do something genuine but was stuck with this, like, I have to just feed the lowest common denominator what they want to eat, which is a story about a two-headed squirrel. And you had the phone company ultimately poisoning all of us, this kind of anti-technology tale about aliens actually running the phone company, but wearing the best disguises ever in the history of. I've drawn so much fan art in my life of that disguise, because it's so often the people who are trying to rip you off or hurt you, a big corporation or whatnot, you can see that they're trying to do it. They try to mask it, but they're basically just wearing a giant cowboy hat with holes cut in it and a little Groucho Marx. But there's nothing you can do because they're in power. So what else can you do? Zach knows that they're in charge at one point, but it's like he can't just tell everyone and they're going to stop using phones. What are we going to do without phones? So it's this overarching, stupid, not even necessarily mean, but just really base and instinctual. The aliens just don't have any sort of capacity for empathy or caring. They're not that bright either, and they're making us as dumb as them. It's like, if you couldn't tell, it's one of my favorite stories about modern culture, human beings, where we're at now in terms of an individual trying to connect with other things, and in the game you're actually becoming or inhabiting the mind of a dolphin. So there's this undercurrent of like the importance of empathy, the importance of teamwork. Half the cast of the game are women. I'm sorry, 3/4, which was also unheard of. Like, I'm playing as a girl in a video game? I'm playing as 3 girls in a video? I go, how much time do we have left? We only have like 10 minutes left already. So, sorry, that's my big, quick gush, unrehearsed gush about the wonderful game you made. And people still, there's like German sequels. They love it in Germany.
I don't know if you know, there's a guy in Italy who's trying to do a live action movie or short movie based on it, and he just on the last week posted a trailer. So
really?
Yeah, it's on YouTube.
I will post that on Destructoid.com.
The trailer, he actually did a really nice job. There's an actor which totally could be Zach, and there's a woman who totally could be Annie. And it's some nice effects with glowing crystals, and you can see the VW, the Volkswagen bus on Mars, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it turns out. But yes, people so do this. I gotta give Matthew Kane credit too. Matthew was my co-designer on this. He came on after I had the design pretty much set. But he ended up, I knew it was going to be too much scripting for me to do by myself, so he came on near the beginning of my scripting and basically did about half of the game in terms of scripting and writing stuff, and that it's so much more fun to do this with someone else, than you're kind of bouncing stuff off of each other all the time.
Sure.
And actually, when I was brainstorming this game, I went up to Seattle area where a friend of Steve Arnold's, a guy named David Spangler, who is a known kind of psychic and author, and I spent 2 days with him brainstorming all these crazy ideas that, kind of the kitchen sink idea of everything that was New Age could show up in this game in some place in terms of locations and ideas. And again, and then came back and had to figure out how to put all that into a cohesive story. But he was really helpful. And then the first pass, Ron felt like it wasn't wacky enough. It wasn't funny enough. So we ended up with this meeting with all the game designers at LucasArts or Lucasfilm Games, going through this and kind of thinking, how can we take it up a few more notches? And my character's name was Jason originally. I think he was a regular reporter. He wasn't a tabloid reporter. I had named the Caponians or the Scholarian, the different characters or the name of the game. All that stuff came out of the meeting, and then the game it was almost identical, except it had kind of gotten this sharp twist into Wacky Land after that meeting.
So it wasn't as did you have the chef who drops the French bread who puts a hole in the sidewalk? That's pretty funny.
Yeah, it was still funny, but it wasn't as funny as say Maniac Mansion wasn't
right.
As funny as it was. And I think that was really good because it just kind of gave it that it felt close, but it wasn't quite there, and this kind of got it into the right groove that okay, now I could take it the rest of the way.
Sure.
Knocked it over a bit into a different notch, and then it just flowed from that.
And
I think that's probably my favorite puzzle, was the whole bit with the bread.
It's so great. Don't even get me started.
Spoiler alert! Yeah,
well, it's one of the first things, I think.
Yeah,
right?
The bread and the garbage disposal. And
oh yeah.
And then how do you get that's how you get the breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
So I just gave it away for anyone who hasn't played the game yet. Sorry.
Okay. There's plenty of other puzzles. Some of them very, very hard. Forming the spacesuit is like one of my favorite. For me as a kid, because I was on the younger side when it came out, to think I could use these taken for granted items to do something incredible. Just send a message to me like you, and one of the themes of the whole game, I don't know if you intended this or not, is like, this is an ordinary world and you're stuck in a certain way, but if you decide to look at your world in a different way, you might have endless potential. You might be on Mars in a VW bus, in a wetsuit, and a fishbowl, and an oxygen tank, and surviving and finding out about, like, it just opened up the concept that I didn't have to just follow a set path. I could decide to be whatever I wanted to be, not to sound too corny, but still, it had a profound effect on me.
That's cool. Well, I actually researched that. I contacted someone at NASA, who's an expert on space.
Scientifically,
Yeah, and I said, is this possible? If we were to do this within a game on Mars, it's different than being out in space. But on Mars there is some pressure, air pressure.
Sure.
He said, yeah, that could actually work. He said, pretty good. So, he validated it. Just use some duct tape, and I think you might have it.
That's right. You need the duct tape, or else you.
Right.
Yeah. I have two real quick Zak McKracken nerd questions. One is simple, and one is maybe complicated. One, so there's the yellow, if I'm remembering correctly, yellow, blue, and white crystals.
Yeah.
The white crystal doesn't have any cool powers, if I remember.
Yeah, I don't remember. I was trying to think of that recently. Was there anything? I think maybe it's just the glue. It's kind of the thing that kind of pulls everything together, I guess, the way we're thinking.
Did you ever want it to do something? Like,
I think I would now if I were to go back and do it. It seems like you kind of need three things. The idea of three things works, but the idea, so we had teleportation, we had mind link, and it seems like the white one should have given you some additional ability. I don't know what it would have been.
Because only you can decide. Like, I can tell you in my fan fiction that I've written about Zak McKracken what the white crystal does, but you're like, what
was your idea?
Oh, I'm trying to remember. I think it was like you could turn into different forms of energy or something, and like power something, like by turning into these things that we don't take as being alive, like electricity or water or whatever, but they actually have a system of molecules that are interacting with each other, and they're able to, like, they don't have free will, but they do things, and our brains are kind of, if weren't electricity, wouldn't be alive. So I was trying to do some sort of, because to me, Zack McKracken, one of the things about it was, as I said before, we're all connected in ways, and we're all alive, and we're all real, and we're all important in ways that you may take for granted if you're just on your phone getting your brain slowly rotted. But you and a dolphin aren't really that different, and you and that woman down the street who you're like intimidated to talk to because she has all this cool stuff in her apartment, she's not that different from you. And in fact, through the mind link thing and through the teleportation thing, where you get to go to different cultures and see, they're not that different either. You go to Africa in the game. It's like the first world. I'm doing it again. I'm ranting about it. Sorry, I'm going to shut up. Anyway, yeah, everyone should play it immediately. The second question, was there ever a sequel planned for Zack McKracken? Was that ever something?
No, and probably because maybe if I had stayed there longer, if I hadn't switched off to the location-based stuff, that would have been the game I would have chosen to do a sequel based on. Part maybe because I wasn't in the company anymore, and there was no push. I don't think anyone internally cared about doing it. So,
and then from talking to Ron Gilbert a few months back, because I thought he was more involved with Zach than I thought, so I brought out like my Zach. I still have the box from the Commodore 64. I still have the newspaper. I kept everything. I was like, look at this. He's like, oh, I didn't really make that. You should talk to Dave. Is like Zack McKracken. They're like the same guy. So talk to him later and thank him if you're willing to do it.
Ron's involvement was really the SCUM engine. We took the version from Winnick Mansion, and I asked for a bunch of additional features that he had to do and put in there. Probably the one thing I would change would be to remove most of the mazes or figure out a way to not do it.
I can see where you're coming from, because that could be a block. To me, it really spoke to, like, even when you think you've got it all figured out, you're teleporting, you're becoming a dolphin, you can still get completely screwed. So don't, get cocky. Like, those mazes humble me every time. And that's like one of the only places you can die. I think you can run out of oxygen.
On Mars, yeah.
Yeah.
In a maze, and those mazes weren't too complex, but yeah, you could be on if you weren't doing it there. I mean, you did have an oxygen source on Mars, right. But if you didn't do things properly, you could die that way.
And that monster could kill you, right? Am I remembering that right, or did I dream that?
I can't remember if he could actually kill you. I think it might have just been. It might have just been a sound effect, but it actually could actually.
Yeah, you never see it, but I'm pretty sure it'll.
Okay. That's one of those things that was left for imagination.
Yeah, it really worked.
Had, like a roar or something in the jungle, which.
That killed me.
But that was just for effect that nothing ever happened.
So I dreamed that killed me, like a real memory, just like
For sure, the jungle one would have been a dream.
Yeah.
But, the jungle, the maze was just a fake maze, actually. The other ones were real mazes, but in the jungle, you just had to go through like two or three openings, and you were out. And it didn't make any difference.
I was doing it. I wrote down a little map. Created.
It would work. It would work. But it was randomly generated, and you just couldn't. If you backtracked, then you had to start over.
Right.
So you kind of like you had to be secure in your direction that you're going forward, and if you went through any three openings, then you ended up outside the maze.
Huh? I had no idea. Huh? Yeah. Wow.
And I think I did something else that was low nasty in the airplane when you're looking for the oxygen tank.
Mm-hmm.
It's always the last one you open. You have to open all five of them, and it's the sixth one. So it didn't make any difference where you put them in. It was always the last one you opened.
Huh? Is it really? What time do you have? I want my clock to be wrong.
I have 2:30 here. So
okay.
You're probably 5:30, huh?
Yeah, I think that was our hour and that went by seriously like 20 minutes for me. I maybe Sinistar will let us go on. And you know the guy who made Sinistar? Is that right?
Yeah, Noah Faustine.
You just know all the
because he was I guess I kind of hired him or found him too. That was really early, but he did something called Coronis Rift.
Oh, sure.
And he worked with me on Indy. He was the co-designer on that one, Indiana Jones Last Crusade. Battlehawks. Is that one? He worked a lot with Larry Holland on all the Sims stuff, so he was in more of those games. And yeah, he's still in the industry. He's now chief game designer at Google.
Oh wow, okay.
Right.
Yeah, so many. They're up at Nexus or Pixar or Google. Oh, we started a little late. I'm going to pretend that we did. I think we actually did. So we probably have a couple more minutes. I'm incredibly curious about how. And you sound like one of those bosses who never wanted to be a boss, and those are always the best bosses, who are never like hungry for control, hungry to like feel as though they're king or whatever. You know, you were thrust into it because you'd been there for a while and people could trust you and you got projects done. So, but then and that was in order to get Mirage done. It's called, right? Which you worked on with Orson Scott Card. You just did that. And then after that, did you leave LucasArts? Did you move on from it?
Yeah, so the Mirage project, we actually got to the point where we got a prototype that worked, and then I think they realized how expensive it was going to be, and at that point, Lucasfilm decided they didn't want to be involved in that. They kind of turned it over to Hughes. Hughes tried to get it marketed, it didn't happen, and our group closed down after 2 years. And so in '92, I really wanted to be doing this location-based entertainment stuff. There wasn't any more of that in Lucas, so I tried doing that for a year as a consultant. Got a couple gigs doing it, but nothing to be sustaining. It wasn't enough. This is the first time that VR was trying to take off, and it just was too expensive and too clunky at the time. I ended up working at Rocket Science Games for a year and a half, and that was not a great experience. I ended up doing a game which was probably my least favorite of all the games I ever did, because it was kind of not in my genre, and it was just really hard to get it to, with the technology. We were using streaming video as a technology, and it was just
okay. Yeah.
And then kind of left games and did, I worked with a company called Live World for 4 years. It was an online community company. We had a group, something called Talk City, which was online community based on the internet, and from '96 to 2000. Followed that at the time it crashed. The .com crash happened. That company survived. It's still around, but they had to reduce. And I was working with a company called Zulu Entertainment for about a year, which had a really cool version of the Mirage type stuff, except with off-the-shelf technology, because things had advanced quite a bit. But that didn't actually make it to location-based. But they're still around. I think if you look up ZuluXULU.com, they were doing some testing on a massively multiplayer type game. I did some Disney consulting. Jonathan Ackley, who was one of the LucasArts designers and project leaders, ended up at Disney as an R&D at Imagineering, and he came up with a whole way to do really cool overlay stuff at the theme parks, interactive overlays on top of the existing park. And so my wife Annie and I got to do some designs for them for Hong Kong Disneyland and for Tokyo Disney Sea. And the one in Tokyo actually got implemented, called the Leonardo Challenge, and it's actually there at the park still. And so I actually got to do some theme park stuff on a lower level than what I was thinking, but got to do that. And I guess really I was working at for 6 years. It was doing something called News Trust, with totally not games. It was nonprofit that was rating the news and having people rate the news for how accurate and how good.
Sure, this is well into the internet age when nobody knows whether they can trust the information that they're getting. So that's a really valuable service.
And it's still around. I think we turned it over to, was it to Pew? It's like a large internet type company doing journalistic type stuff. And then I think that's around the time the iPad came out, and I said, okay, looks like full circle. I can now do apps and games with a small team, and let me learn how to do that. And that, I started by doing a few apps based on my wife's published books for middle school kids, basically graphic novel type stories, middle school confidential series, and those are out. And then the Rube Works game, and then and now that plus Thimbleweed Park, which
you're involved with. You're on the team for that.
So so far, Ron had a really successful Kickstarter. Ron and Gary had the design. I got to spend a couple of days with them a couple of weeks ago, brainstorming, and kind of fleshing out the puzzles and the characters for the first act of the game. And we'll probably be doing that at least another 1 or 2 times while Ron is getting the underlying engine in place. And I probably really won't start scripting until around June, and then diving into that pretty much full time and doing this most of the, well, it's not Scum, but the equivalent of Scum scripting, wiring up rooms, doing cutscenes and dialogue and all that.
How does that feel to return to this genre that you helped create?
It's fun. I mean, it's like it's so long ago, but we've learned a whole lot. And but the it took you kind of just dove in and just started doing it again. It's like no time had passed. So we've been in touch with each other all along, so it wasn't like taking each other up after 20 years. But getting into this, and in fact, both Ron and Noah were brainstorming with me on the Rube Works game. They came over for a couple of days, and we went through the game and came up with ideas. So we've done that with each other's games or projects where we'll jump on and help out and give ideas and suggestions and play test or whatever. So even though it's kind of keeping those same connections, which is really nice.
Amazing. Well, would you want to, now that you've seen how well Thimbleweed Park has done, and it has a Maniac Mansion feel to it, though it's clearly its own thing, but it feels as though, like, if you went down the street from Maniac Mansion, you might end up in Thimbleweed Park, and this is what else goes on in that world. Because Zach's world is like Maniac Mansion, but to me is different. There's Maniac Mansion, it feels more like Airplane, whereas Airplane the movie, which is just a straight spoof, whereas Zach feels like it uses the language of comedy to communicate an idea that's a little bit, you can tell which one I like more. I love them both. Like, I've played them both to death. But Zach, like, even if the comedy were to ever fall flat, not that I think it does, the meaning behind it is always so interesting and gives you so much to chew on. I just want to see you make more of Zak McKracken.
Yeah, well the nice thing is that after Ron gets done with this, if we get done with this first game, there will be this new, classic graphic adventure engine that maybe there's a potential I could use it for some future project. I don't know yet. That would be fun. I would love to see Disney be willing to reissue all of our old games. Since Disney now owns LucasArts, and they're already doing that now with Double Fine on a couple of games that Tim did. I would love to see all of the games get reissued in some form, so where people can play them without having to, essentially pirate the games. You can't afford them now. I think someone showed me a copy of Zach selling for $2,000 or something on
what?
eBay, like a week or two ago.
I have a copy of Zach. I can send you the pictures. I still have the Commodore floppy disk.
Yeah, I have one too, but I'm just going to hold on to it. I wish I had a whole crate of them. No idea that they would raise in value. But so, if there's a demand, if people buy up the whatever games are reissued, then the chance of having all the games reissued at some point are more likely. And then there's always the possibility of either doing a sequel, or maybe I would go the route that Ron did and just come up with something totally different, and in my style and do that.
Well, as much as I love Zak McKracken, what you created, it's really what you did and what your teammates did with it. I would follow the creative team wherever you went. Cool. More so than if another Zach game came out but you weren't involved at this point, I'd just be kind of like, well, I'll give it a shot, but it's hard for me to get as excited about it.
Well, I'm thinking probably because I essentially stopped doing most of those Lucas games in the late, around '89, I guess. I don't think I have the same name recognition that, say, Ron does, because he did the Monkey Island games in the early '90s, and he then did some other really fabulous stuff after that. And I was kind of outside of the game industry, so Kickstarter would be, I think, much more difficult for me to pull off than it would.
Well, for you, but you and Ron and Gary together,
that might be possible.
I mean, I think it's going to be. And we're out of time. Sorry, Sinistar. Sinistar sending me text messages saying, "Shut up, quit gushing about that thing." You're only going to gain more fans. You're going to gain people who have never heard of Maniac Mansion, who are going to play Thimbleweed Park, because if you couldn't tell, I'm quite confident it's going to be fun to play. And then you're going to have a whole new audience, and the next Kickstarter will do even better. That is my solid guess.
In the meantime, people can check out Rube Works. They could follow me on Twitter at David B. Fox, and I talk to people. I'm not like a hermit. So,
and the I'm sorry, is it Amazing Eggplant? Is that the name of the company? Electric. I'm sorry about that. So,
There's also another Twitter. I think I would just use David B. Fox for Twitter, though. People could find me there. It'd probably be easier.
Got it.
And that's it. ElectricEggplant.com. There's also a Rescue on Fractalus video that I have there on Electric Eggplant, which is from the original press conference where we did this whole produce thing where kind of introduced the game to the press in 1984. So you can go there and watch that.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
And I have to look up. There's some other stuff. There's a lot to look up after this episode. I gotta at least see the alien shaking the ship around. I can't wait to watch that either.
Watch the alien pop up.
Yeah. I'm at TronNauts on Twitter. And I'm writing things for Destructo.com. You can look at that. You can watch the show later on YouTube, youtube.com/SubHolmesShow. You can listen to it on Libsyn and iTunes. And I think that's everything. But don't leave, but we have to say goodbye and pretend we're leaving.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. It was great.
Yeah, it was.
Bye all.
For me, it was. I don't know.